Hi, this is Pete. I have a deep cut for you today. Mike Pence. When Mike Pence said on Wednesday night that the Trump administration was a champion of the environment and health care, we were reminded of two things that he did as governor of Indiana. One was to make it impossible for cities and counties to limit or ban the tax on plastic bags. Plastic bag user fees do actually cut down on the amount of plastic that is then found out in the wild. Big environmentalist, that guy. On health care, he also signed a bill that made women responsible for paying for burial or cremation for fetal remains after a miscarriage. Awesome. Yesterday, we reminded you that his handling of the biggest outbreak of HIV in Indiana history is the stuff of public health case studies now, and that these are just some of the things that we happen to remember off the tops of our little cat heads. What would we find if we did a deep dive? That miscarriage burial bill, that was part of a much bigger bill that also outlawed abortions based on fetal abnormalities and banned fetal tissue donation, which, by the way, is what helped create the magical elixir that cured Pence's master, Donald Trump, just last week of COVID-19. In 2015, Pence signed a religious freedom law whose sweeping language permitted Indiana businesses to refuse to serve LGBT Americans, which was very much like Southern businesses used to use to discriminate against African Americans during the days of segregation. The backlash against this bill was so swift he had to amend it, and then he claimed that people somehow misunderstood the intent. But come on, we were born at night, but not last night. He also blocked the resettlement of Syrian refugees in Indiana and illegally tried to cut off federal aid to existing refugees. A federal judge eventually blocked that action, writing that the governor's order clearly constitutes national origin discrimination and in no way directly or even indirectly promotes the safety of Indiana citizens. At a time when lawmakers on both sides of the aisle were tackling the nation's drug problem with less focus on incarceration, Pence signed a bill making mandatory minimum drug sentencing. Many drug users, as we know, tend to sell drugs on the side to support their addictions. Thanks to Pence, any Indiana resident convicted twice of selling meth or heroin would now be sentenced to a full decade in prison. At the last minute, he killed an application for an $80 million federal grant to start a statewide preschool program. Education officials in his own administration thought the grant was a great idea, but conservative opponents of secular public education had complained. When reporters asked Pence about this decision, he said that the federal government grant had too many strings attached. But when asked, he couldn't actually name what those strings were, not even one. Eventually, he was forced to reapply for the grant. As a member of Congress, Pence sponsored the 2007 bill to defund Planned Parenthood, the first of its kind, and the legislation set off a more than a decade-old congressional battle to defund the organization. He introduced that legislation multiple times until he left the House in 2011. He became a big hit with early Tea Party nutjobs and the Koch brothers, more about them later, when he successfully and quietly killed a Senate cap-and-trade bill that would have charged companies for polluting. The bill would have been a big chunk of change for Koch Industries, which releases some 24 million tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere a year and owns millions of acres of untapped oil reserves in Canada, plus coal-fired plants and oil refineries. Needless to say, they've been smitten ever since and a supporter of whatever he wanted to do. Pence was also criticized for his treatment of Keith Cooper, who spent 9 years in prison for an armed robbery he didn't commit. He was released in 2006, but on the condition he admit guilt, which made it impossible for him to get a decent job. The prosecutor and the Indiana Parole Board, using DNA evidence and victim recantations, urged the governor to pardon him immediately, but Pence dragged out the process for years, pushing Cooper to be retried instead. Pence finally left the decision up to his successor, Governor Eric Holcomb, also a Republican, who granted Cooper a pardon within weeks of taking office. It was the first time in Indiana a pardon was granted on the basis of innocence rather than clemency. Needless to say, Cooper, who calls himself a Christian, does not forgive Pence, who also calls himself a Christian, because he says he is a hypocrite. Fast forward to 2016, and Pence is vice president. Trump began to appoint an extraordinary number of officials with ties to the Kochs and to Pence, especially in positions that affected Koch industries financially, such as those dealing with regulatory, environmental, and fiscal policy. Remember Scott Pruitt, the military anti-regulatory attorney general of Oklahoma? Well, he had been heavily supported by the Kochs and he was appointed director of the Environmental Protection Agency. Pruitt, in turn, placed Patrick Traylor, a lawyer for Koch Industries and other fossil fuel companies, in charge of EPA's enforcement of key anti-pollution laws. As the Times has reported, a document called A Roadmap to Repeal, which was written by Koch operatives, has guided the EPA's reversal of Obama administration clean air and climate regulations, which is kind of funny considering that Pence spent some time at the debate the other night talking about how we've never had cleaner air or cleaner water. Don McGahn, remember him? Who had done legal work for Freedom Partners, became White House counsel. Betsy DeVos, haven't heard much from her lately, a billionaire heiress who had been a major member of the Koch's donor network and a supporter of Pence's, was named Secretary of Education. The new director of the CIA was Mike Pompeo, the congressman who represented Charles Koch's district in Wichita, Kansas. Before Koch ran for office, the Kochs had invested in his aerospace business. Pompeo, one of these former transition team members, had said to the Times, wasn't even on Trump's radar, but he was brought in to meet him and got appointed like the next day. A recent analysis by the Checks and Balances Project found that 16 high-ranking officials in the Trump White House had ties to the Kochs. The pattern continued among lower-level appointees as well, including in Pence's office, which was stocked with Koch alumni. Pence reportedly consulted with Charles Koch before hiring his speechwriter Stephen Ford, who had previously worked at Freedom Partners. While many of these people have been fired, indicted, or moved on to other positions, like Secretary of State, suffice it to say that this administration, and Pence in particular, seems to be well in the grip of some of the darkest, dirtiest money on the planet. And the interesting thing is that the Kochs were not even interested in Trump. They were interested in Pence. See you next time.